All right, Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. So before we get into that, we are going to look at ratification. All right, ratification was when the Constitution was adopted. We just got finished up with the Constitutional Convention. At the end of it, everybody signed it. It was all great. See this one down here, Rhode Island. Back up, Rhode Island there. They were the only ones not to send any delegates. They didn't want a federal government at all. However, at the end of it, everybody got together, signed it. And if you remember Article 7, which was the ratification article of the Constitution, stated 2/3, which would be 9 states, needed to ratify it for it to come into effect for those 9 states. That's still required 4 more to reach the original 13. New Hampshire, it was the 9th state, 1788. 1787 was the year that the Constitution was signed and sent off for ratification. And that kick-started a big debate, a giant flame war throughout the newspapers of the 13 colonies between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Massachusetts kind of came around to signing it. I don't remember which number they were. There was 5 states that signed it right away, and then the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists started having their debates in the newspapers throughout the colonies in order to discuss some of the issues that the states had with the Constitution itself. With Massachusetts signing, they signed it on the promise of a Bill of Rights to come in, as well as they made some suggestions for amendments, changes to the Constitution. So New Hampshire was the 9th state, 1788. They declared later on that the first Congress under the new republic would start in 1789. So a year later, that's to get representatives set up and everything, the new presidential election to happen, that kind of thing. Rhode Island was the last of the 13 original colonies. And that was 1790. That was a full year. Congress had been running, the new government, the new republic had been running for a year before Rhode Island got into it. And Rhode Island almost plunged us into a civil war. There was a guy named William West. He had been a Revolutionary War colonel, I believe, but he was involved in the Rhode Island Supreme Court. He was heavily involved in politics since before the Revolution. And he was a staunch Anti-Federalist. He did not want a federal government. And he led a group of 1,000 armed men in rebellion against ratification. Basically, he stormed a picnic that was being had in Providence, which was the capital of Rhode Island at the time, and forced the Federalists to concede his points that they were not celebrating a new Constitution, that they were only celebrating the 4th of July. Strange aside there. However, the debate continued, and a year later, Rhode Island went through 2 votes for ratification. The first vote was in heavily Anti-Federalist district, and then they moved the vote to a Federalist supported district, which ratified the Constitution. All right, so some of the arguments, the Anti-Federalists, they did not want that federal government, anti meaning against, and they believed a federal government would have too much power. Now, this federal government that is set up, it was not a centralized government. The Constitution in no way runs your local city, right? Unlike other nations such as France that has a highly centralized government where the central government, the federal government, can dictate who your local mayor is, who your dog catcher is. You don't vote on that locally. But we have a distinct federalism where there's different layers of government, as you remember from the last lesson there. They believed that the colonies themselves were too large and the capital city was going to be too far removed from the frontiers of the colonies in order to effectively govern. Much like England, England was all the way across the ocean. How could England? That was one of the arguments against England having local control in the colonies. They believed the same here, that a federal government would be too far removed from the outside or the outer banks of the colonies. They were worried that there was no Bill of Rights at the time. Of course, we had the English Bill of Rights, which we get a lot of civil law from, but several states in their own constitutions had a Bill of Rights written into the Constitution. They wanted that Bill of Rights in order to protect the civil liberties of individuals, of states, of communities. Federalists, on the other hand, they argued that the Union probably wouldn't survive. The Union that had just spent 18 years fighting a civil or a revolutionary war against Great Britain probably wouldn't survive without a federal or a national government. The Articles of Confederation were too weak, and they could already see calls for states going their own way. So they believed a stronger central government was needed in order to tax, in order to raise an army, in order to influence trade, that kind of thing. They also countered the Anti-Federalists, saying that there were built-in safeguards. Remember, we talked about the checks and balances, the separations of powers, so that no one branch of government could get too strong, and the states themselves countered the federal government as well as the individuals. If you remember the consent of the governed philosophy, where the people choose or consent to being governed by the people that they choose to be in government, those 4 boxes of liberty. So that was a check that the people had against the government, and the government itself checked itself through having different branches as well as different layers. However, in order to pass ratification, they did agree to a Bill of Rights. The central argument around the Bill of Rights was the Federalists didn't want it at all. Their argument was that if we have a Bill of Rights, our rights would be relegated or limited to just the rights that are listed or enumerated. That was their argument. They say, hey, look, if we say we have these things, those are the only things that we're going to have. Whereas the Anti-Federalists, their argument is if we don't say we have these things, we will never get these things. And it turns out over the years, over the last 240-ish years, both are correct. Both arguments were correct. If we hadn't had a Bill of Rights, then we would have lost those rights. They would have been legislated away. However, having those Bill of Rights, we've kind of been limited to just those rights listed. There's a few expansions on those rights that were listed, like there's no, for instance, there's no right to privacy enumerated. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that being secure in your person, in your papers, that implies a right to privacy. So some things have been expanded, but mostly we've been restricted in our use of rights. And that's it for this. Like I said, it was going to be short. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Thanks.